Right, so I shall say one more time, if you want to discuss should arts lead the big society, then please stay in here and come towards the front of the room in a kind of big society, stepping forward, taking responsibility kind of way. And if you don't want to talk about arts in the big society, then bugger off. What are you doing? You're kind of deciding, well, you're not allowed to, I'll tell you what you're not allowed to do is kind of suck it and see. You're not allowed to kind of see how good the speakers are and then walk out if they're not good enough, because it'll just be demoralising to them, to be honest. Okay, so we've got 5 speakers who are going to speak for no more than 3 to an absolute maximum of 5 minutes on the topic of should the arts lead the big society. It's a fantastic panel with lots of different perspectives, and then we're going to pull you in and we're going to knock this issue about. We're going to give it a good going over before we break at 4 o'clock. We haven't got much time. We've already lost a bit of time, so we're going to go straight into it. First of all, our first speaker is Kevin Corrigan, who is cultural broker at Ilex Derry, Londonderry. Did I get your name right, Kevin? Thank you. Okay, over to you.
Oh, yes. You're going to introduce us all? Sorry, I thought I still had a number of minutes. Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you to ACE and the RSA for the invitation. I'm all right with the notion of big society, insofar as I or anybody else seems to understand or know what it might become.
The person who knows most about it in the world is sitting next to you, so it'll be fine.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing more about it. As I say, I'm all right with the notion of it. Ideas of localism, local government, devolution of actual authority and more authority to local government, volunteerism, cooperative social enterprises, open transparent government. Very difficult to argue against that. I'm not so comfortable with the notions that surround better citizenship. I think that's slightly odd as to which of us knows what a better citizen is, but I am very comfortable around the notion of active citizenship. And I do think the arts have a role to play here and have an opportunity here, potentially. I don't particularly anticipate that big society will see people running post offices or waste management for their areas or that kind of thing. I don't think that would be particularly good. Services need to be provided by people who have a system that is national or local or regionally centralised and actually know what they're doing. And I'm not sure volunteerism can actually come into play and look after some of those things. But I do think art has a role to play and big society has a role to play in making meaning, in leading and in energising communities. In Ireland, I'm not sure we kind of picked up on community arts in the same way or as quickly or as readily as it did here. I think part of that is a kind of a post-Civil War phenomenon, that the 2 dominant parties in Ireland came from that debate rather than a left-right debate. So community arts wasn't so politicised so early on. And I recall being at a conference, when I was thinking about big society, I recall being at a conference about 15 years ago where the worst type of community arts practice was very much on show, where people felt empowered. This was the big word. I've through community arts, I've been empowered. And they then very soon went on to feel that they could go and empower others, very soon having been in some kind of facilitated process. I had an issue with it because very, very rarely did they seem to be empowered to actually go into a theatre. They very rarely seem to be empowered to go into a gallery, having gone through some kind of arts process. And at the end of this conference, they had this, this facilitation or this evaluation techniques that you'll all have seen, where the kind of flip chart paper goes up on the wall, and you're all given a little block of post-its, and we all go round and we kind of respond to the question at the top of the thing, the kind of thing. And one of the questions on the top of this kind of flip chart paper was, how can we manage personal and social change for other people? And I just thought, call the cops. Bloody hell, this is like, somebody's freaking me out here. It's like, you can't do this. And in a worst case scenario, this is what big society could kind of turn into. Some kind of well-meaning notion that gets hijacked without any kind of making of meaning, without any kind of leadership, and without any kind of real energy, without any kind of positive outputs. It'll lose energy, it'll lose faith within, 3 to 5 years, depending on how many, do-gooders, if I'm allowed to use that phrase, are around. So, in Derry, with City of Culture, we have a clear target. The target is 2013, and the 2013 represents a new beginning, and 2013 begins now, if you like. We have 3 key target audiences, and we want to use an approach which we in shorthand describe as edge to centre. So we want to see if we can reach out to people who are currently disengaged, culturally disenfranchised, if you like, and that by the time 2013 comes around, they feel they can be centre stage. For the DCMS process, we had a 10-project highlight programme. We call those the 10 highlights now. We're open to the notion that the highlight could come from some community group. They could identify that. We state we want 100% access. We're going to have to work with those. But we'll have to work with those in a curated way. There will still have to be a conductor of the orchestra. It still requires, real investment. One of the challenges for us in this process is whether we can actually get beyond elected representatives, whether we can get beyond the community groups, the organised community sector. Actually, because it's easy to reach those, but to actually get beyond the people who are disenfranchised, to kind of say, you have a voice, you have something to say, but you must take responsibility for what it is you have to say, and you must take responsibility for listening. This doesn't mean that the audience is out. And, I think audience are participants in things. It struck me very recently, again, when I saw Black Watch for the second time, that as somebody from Ireland, to look at that piece of work and to feel an empathy with a regiment in a show about Iraq, and to feel a contemporary empathy with what's happening in Afghanistan, which I have no other kind of, personal, emotive reference point for, as somebody from there. That is about active citizenship. There is a role for art making, which gives us all a wider sense of ourselves in the world. So big society needs to be invested in with that perspective, with the perspective of taking responsibility for what it means to be part of that society. I think the positive thing is that at least we've moved forward from that cult of the individual. But my view is big society will cost if people are serious about doing it well, and if they do it well, the arts have a role.
Great, thank you. Brilliant. Our next speaker is one of the stars of State of the Arts 1. So he's back here for State of the Arts 2. Andrew Dixon is Director of Creative Scotland.
Oh, good. I didn't turn up at the last one, I don't think. Big society, it's actually what the arts do. And if you go on my Facebook site, I say I'm a committed northerner. I've lived in an area which really values society, that has brought up the cooperative movement, that has had friendly societies, people do up their parks. It's got the biggest community foundation in Europe, raised over £50 million for an endowment, many of the streams of which support the arts. So there is nothing new about the arts engaging with big society. I think the issue here is how, if this is going to be on the agenda, we ignore the politics and we move the thing forward and use it as some sort of movement to create a rallying call for the arts. I think one of the things that stands in the way of this is there are very good local authorities. I'm very committed to local authorities. I've worked in them. I've worked with 96 or 98 of them in my career. Very good local authorities who enable this sort of activity and volunteering engagement with the arts happen, and there are others that are about provision and stopping. And it was quite interesting this morning to hear that idea of local cultural partnerships as some sort of model where you do engage the cultural sector to run the culture in their cities and to engage with other issues in cities, such as citizenship. But that rallying call is the thing, and the arts are so good at that. In Scotland, the fashion movement, which started some 25 years ago, has brought together society in so many small villages, towns, to create festivals, community events, volunteering, 32,000 young people learning music each year as a result of it, but really creating a sense of place. And I think place is key to this, and the kind of connectivity between the arts and place. Place, pride, philanthropy, those things do fit together. And if we can find the formula that captures those and uses the arts for social enterprises that are doing things of value. There's a great organisation in Glasgow called Impact Arts, social enterprise, very clever social enterprise. They sold more Christmas trees than any other commercial operator in Glasgow, I believe, to raise money for their cultural programme at Christmas. But they're doing really interesting work in working with the homeless and housing, using cultural projects to refurbish furniture to create new homes. That is the sort of rallying call that the arts can be part of in a society. I moved to Scotland about a year ago, actually, and I knew about 8 festivals. I only lived an hour across the border, but I knew of 8 festivals. And I got to Scotland and I asked for a list of festivals, and the then Arts Council gave me a list of 38 festivals. And I went to 3 festivals in the first week and they weren't on the list. So I came back and said, how many festivals are there in Scotland? Well, the answer is there's 280 of them. And this is the Creative Scotland list of festivals in Scotland. Now, every one of these has some sort of root in society, has some reason for existence, whether it's the Pit and Weem Festival where people open their houses as art galleries, whether it's one of those fèis festivals and celebrations. I think our engagement is very much around celebration in society, celebration of the role that the arts can play in people finding their place.
Great. Andrew, thank you very much. And our third speaker is Miranda McKinney, who's director of the Reading Agency. Miranda.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Lots of theoretical stuff about the big society. I hope it's okay with you guys if I kind of ground what I'm going to say in my area, which is about reading and libraries and people power. I think it's a really interesting time to be here at the point when libraries are about to move from MLA to the Arts Council. And next year, I hope that maybe we'll have a librarian sitting here or making a keynote speech. Can I just ask for a show of hands? Do any of you work with libraries? So there's a kind of, bit of stuff to hold on to. I mean, I've always found it really weird that reading and libraries are kind of often missed out of the picture when you talk about the arts. And particularly weird because reading, A, is one of our biggest participative art forms. And B, when you read, if you think what happens, you're kind of instantly plugged into somebody else's creative world. You're in a kind of deep and intimate connection with an artist, and your imagination fuses with theirs to create new worlds, new understanding. And so if reading's part of the arts, that must apply to libraries too. And libraries, I would argue, are an absolutely crucial way that we as a society ensure that we all can access the personal power that comes when you're a reader. And reading isn't just nice, it's essential. You can't be part of society without being a reader. It's an art form that needs to reach everyone, and it doesn't. 1 in 6 adults struggle with low literacy skills. That's a really, really scary figure. And libraries are absolutely key to tackling this. And in terms of a big society agenda, libraries are surely the ultimate community enabler, a really potent symbol of our collective power and our civic pride. It would be hard, I think, to think of a more important chunk of our cultural fabric to an agenda that's about community power and action. And of course, that's an agenda that long predates the big society. So libraries are changing in a way that I think has huge relevance to this conference. The way they support reading has become much more social, much more dynamic, everything from reading groups to whole city read-ins. And that creates a very interesting new creative platform for volunteering and huge opportunities to join with the arts. So we lead, with libraries, one of the UK's biggest cultural opportunities for children, which is the Summer Reading Challenge. It reaches 750,000 4 to 12-year-olds, happens in every local authority. There's about 97% of local authorities run it. And this year, it started to have attached to it a really interesting volunteering programme where teenagers support the younger children in getting through the challenge. And it's a very interesting mixed economy model because it's not about job substitution, it's about community involvement that adds capacity to, but doesn't, and in my view shouldn't, replace the professionally run library service. So we're a charity specialising in helping libraries spread reading, and we're involved in lots of work to transform services by sharing power with their users. And in April, we start work with some big lottery funding in 20 disadvantaged communities from Sunderland to Hounslow in a programme called My Voice, which immerses young people in creative reading and draws them in through artists like Akala of the Hip Hop Shakespeare Company. At the same time as doing that, it involves them in making decisions about library services taking on accredited volunteering roles and spending budgets. So they're becoming activists and service shapers. And our experience is that they want and need support from library staff, as do most volunteers. So even though we're huge champions of community power, I'm dubious about the likely long-term success of libraries in disadvantaged areas being run wholly by volunteers. I hope I'm wrong, and I know that a lot of local authorities are planning that. I don't think it's the way forward. Last year, volunteering through libraries rose by 8%, and if we play it right, we're at a stage of development where I think we could see a whole really exciting new wave of public involvement coming through joining up arts, library and reading work. There's also the terrifying possibility that in some areas we're about to blow it. We're about to leave a library network that's unable to act, and it's much more than the buildings, it's the development staff that are at risk. So there's a really urgent need for some joined-up thinking, and if we're serious about creating more activism, a big society agenda, we surely have to be serious about having a dynamic library role at the heart of most of our communities. So I want to finish with a call to the arts world, which is, you may talk about not being very good at lobbying. I think you're extraordinarily good, especially in relation to libraries, who I think have done a fantastic job, except in the area of lobbying. So please embrace reading and libraries in your lobbying activity, because, boy, do we need it right now. Thanks.
Penultimate speaker is Jessie Norman, who's Conservative MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, and not only does Jessie believe in the big society, he wrote the book.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Matthew, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. I should say that I come to this topic as someone who entered politics rather late in life, and in many ways have been embedded in the arts and in artistic organisations for almost my entire adulthood. And indeed before that I was the son of artist, painter, and both my mother and grandmother are painters. I used to run an NGO which was involved in distributing books in Eastern Europe during the communist period, and I also taught philosophy at one point. So I've got some perspective of the different kinds of organisations that would make up a really successful and big society. And I've been deeply involved with two organisations in particular that you will have come across, I'm sure. One is the Roundhouse in Chalk Farm, which is a phenomenal institution which combines this amazing performing arts space with an extraordinary program of reaching out to disadvantaged younger people and infusing them with the joy and love of the arts, and then having them go out and perform in their own right. And we've now had, I think, our second year of sending a Roundhouse theatre group to the Edinburgh Festival with material that they've worked up themselves, and that, I think, is an amazing achievement. And the second is the Hay Festival, which is, of course, just around the corner from me in Herefordshire. And that in its own right, I think, has also done an extraordinary amount to spread an understanding of the written word, to spread a joy in literacy and in reading, and to take that around the world into other countries as well. And what is striking to me about those two institutions is that they were both acts of extraordinary private social entrepreneurship, which reached out of conventional boxes and categories. They were very much about empowering the institutions and the people, the cities, the villages around them, the areas around them. And to both, it was this combination of private entrepreneurship and energy and money and arts council and state support that made the whole thing work, because it was undoubtedly true that there are things you can't do without that additional component. And it's vital that everyone on all sides of the political spectrum recognises that, and I think they do. And the Arts Council, of course, itself is a remarkable example of a piece of, in its own way, big society thinking. There was a new institution when Keynes thought it up. It came out of that massively capacious brain. It wasn't an obvious kind of thing, and yet it has found an extraordinary niche, not just in our culture, but I think in the world. Let me talk briefly about the big society, which shares with great art the characteristic of being indefinable. I think it's important to keep apart two things. One is the political programme, which is so much now associated with people with a kind of agenda of spending cuts, but actually has no particular relationship to it. That just happens to be the economic circumstances that this country finds itself in. And the second is what I would call the governing philosophy, the idea. And what I've found is that people are nervous or sometimes opposed to what they take to be the politics of it, but actually in a deep way, when they reflect on it, rather excited often about the governing philosophy. Of course, as Mandy Rice Davis said, I would say that, wouldn't I, having written some of it? But let me just focus on one particular point. We've talked a little about institutions, but let me also just focus on the idea of the individual that is embedded in, I think, this line of thought, because it's profoundly friendly to the arts. The individual as the active self. That is to say, the individual as engaged and linking with the people and institutions around him or her, in contrast to the passive self, the utilitarian self, the self that's presupposed in our economics, and so much of the economics that's led us to this extraordinary economic crash. And I think that contrast is vitally important, because the active self is a full, cognitively rich, emotionally rich person in all its dimensions. And that's the kind of self, it seems to me, that is presupposed by and able to contribute amazingly to successful artistic endeavour. What you get from that is a sense of compassion, in the sense not of pity, but of fellow feeling, of shared experience, and of linkage and connection. And I think the other thing you get from it is a focus on excellence, because the active self, the engaged self, discharging his or her capabilities to their maximum, automatically is finding resources within themselves and within society that they may never have contemplated being there. And that has certainly been our experience both at the Roundhouse and at the Hay Festival. Let me shut up and let me say that, in my view, therefore, the answer to this question is an emphatic yes. The arts should lead the big society, and they are profoundly of its kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesse. And then finally, before we open up for questions, Gavin Stride, who's Director of Farnham Maltings and Caravan. Gavin.
Thank you. I was on a visit to Brittany a couple of years ago with my son, and we were walking around a fairly austere Catholic cathedral in Vannes, and at one end of the cathedral there's this beautiful stained glass window of the crucifixion. And we were following a fairly elderly couple, and the wife turned to her husband and said, you see the sky around Jesus' head? And the husband said, yes. And she said, that's the colour I want our bathroom. And you all laugh, but there's an example of a woman using the arts to improve the quality of her life. I run a small arts organisation based in a town in the Surrey-Hampshire borders, and when I'm asked what I do, I say that I help people live longer, feel safer, and be happier. Based on a belief, as Isabella Allende put it so elegantly, that the arts are to humankind what dreams are to the individual. And when I got there 7 years ago, I said, and it was quoted in the local paper, that Farnham will get the arts centre it deserves. And I believed it then, and I believe it now. And that's led me to some fairly extraordinary conversations. We now are about to sign an agreement to run the museums and the libraries in the town and for the borough. The police recently decided, because of cuts made to Surrey County Council, to close their police stations and did a piece of public consultation. And it's come out that they've decided that they should move in with us. And I was fairly sceptical of this conversation until I looked on the side of the cars and it says, keeping Surrey safe. And I thought, do you know what, we're doing the same job. I would contest that for the arts to contribute to the big society, or society as my mum used to call it, we need to challenge our view of what the arts are and are not. We need to reject ideas that things that are posed too often as opposites, and this is something that Bobby talked about earlier on. And they're often used to prop up an established view and the contemporary world. Here are a few. Excellence or popular. Accessible or experimental. Maker or audience. Local or international. Amateur or professional. Dare I say it, instrumental or whatever the other one is.
Intrinsic.
Intrinsic, thank you. These are not opposites. They are both constituents of good art. People make art in all sorts of ways and express who they are as knitters, as cooks, as gardeners, as cake decorators. We tell stories to our children, we dance at weddings, we speak poetry at our funerals, we sing songs to our country at the start of football matches. Art is everywhere. All we need to do is listen and hear, look and see, touch and feel. Big society can't be about propping up the old system, but finding new ways of making sense of the world. We need to understand the things that people are prepared to do for free that they wouldn't do if you paid for them to do. As 10cc, it's the things we do for love. I'm not arguing for an amateur rules model, or maybe I am. What I do know is that the more people that make a pot, the more they are more likely to recognise what an extraordinary potter can do, understand the craft, and be prepared to pay for it. You see, participation and excellence belong hand in hand. Finally, we need to rediscover our generosity. Try saying we rather than I. Share the credit. My sense is that in the arts at least things are getting better. Under the last government we used to stab each other in the back. Under this government we're stabbing each other in the front. I'm not sure if the arts can make society, but they help us think, understand, feel, imagine, develop our emotional intelligence, bring us together, help us imagine, heal, build, empathise, and develop a vocabulary to make collective sense of the world. Thank you.
See, what's going to happen now is when people go home this evening and they go back to their partners or whatever, and what was your day like? They'll say, well, it was great, but there's this really funny story about the cathedral in front. Anyway, so thank you for giving us all a way of opening up the day when we go back and tell people about it. I'm going to ask the panel one question, which I'm going to ask them to answer incredibly quickly while you're thinking about the questions you're going to ask them, and also not to just set the trend of very, very fast answers, which is that one of the suggestions that John, Nell and I made in the pamphlet that we wrote was that if you emphasise the kind of big society potential of art in relation to civic activism, thinking about the good society, it would suggest a premium on participation rather than merely consumption in terms of what it was that we were funding. I'm interested to know whether our speakers broadly agree with that. I'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, first of all, I enjoyed reading your pamphlet, but I don't think the big society will understand some of the terminology in it. Eudaimonic constructivism isn't exactly the snappy brand. I think that one of the key things for me about this is, and I may not be answering your question, is creating meeting places in society, creating social capital, the places where people connect with each other. And the arts is so good at that. At Newcastle Gates Initiative, we did a lot of work around this, just creating the moments, the Eat Festival where 350 people get on a bridge and eat and celebrate and bring culture together. I think if we're talking big society, we ought to be talking about little societies as well, and little places and streets. And if we're talking big society, we should be talking international societies and how we connect globally.
Thank you. Miranda?
Yes, I think is my answer to that, but that there's a kind of interesting thread between participation and activism, and that's really worth thinking about how you move from one to the other.
Great. Jesse?
Well, I think very much yes, and there's a specific reason for that, which is that it goes back to the distinction I was drawing between the active self and the passive self. If you think of the self as an economic entity, then what reason can you give someone to get up from the couch where they're sitting like a potato in front of the TV? You have to have a conception of the self as habitual, able to get excited about things. And if you do that, then you feed whatever the little passion you find is, and suddenly you've no idea how it will take off and become a raging storm. So I absolutely think participation is the essence of this.
Gavin?
My only suspicion is I think we've got to get rid of the kind of drug dealer mentality that says, let's get them in on the kind of soft stuff and then we'll get them on the hard stuff later on. And that still exists, the kind of view that participation is the kind of popular end, but actually the real art is at the other end, and that's need to be eschewed.
I'm just interested, I'm not going to, because you're take the piss out of me, but I did some work on politics a few years ago, political participation, and actually argued, kind of conversely to that you need a shallow end in politics. The problem with politics is there's only a deep end to dive into. So, do you think that argument...
As long as it's an excellent shallow end, that's all I'm marking.
It does not. It has to be participation in an experience as well as participation in something. I mean, I always use Live Aid as a really interesting moment. People can remember their point of engagement with Live Aid, which was, probably the biggest big society project that the UK or the world has seen. But it was about sharing a moment, whether you're at the concert, whether you're watching on television. You're engaging with it. And the same can happen with live events in very small communities or an experience watching opera in a cinema. Actually it's the shared experience of being there and feeling something together. And I think that's what the arts does so well.
Kevin?
As I said earlier, I think the audience is active. That is an act of participation when one goes to see something. I think there may be a role... And it'll be interesting to see if politics does lead it this way. There may be a role whereby the arts, but do try and go out to meet that audience, and to actually not just to meet that audience with the shallow end or with the softer end of stuff, but to meet that audience from a research perspective, to see what is it in terms of making meaning in the world, in terms of making meaning for that audience, for that community.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's a question here. I'll take kind of two or three together and then ask the panel to kind of, or maybe more.
Hi there, my name's Toby Lowe from Helix Arts. I think the question about participation is really, really important because participation in some respects has to mean more than participation in experience. It has to be about the opportunity to produce and explore your own story and communicate that to others. And that's partly why the arts are really important to big society ideas, because unless people can explore their own stories and share those with others, then other people won't be interested in helping or being active in those people's lives. And I think that's really where the kind of nexus of art and big society comes. But there's been an interesting distinction made between big society as a philosophical concept and big society as a political project. My question would be, have the cuts that is the context in which we're talking about this killed the possibilities of big society as a philosophical project?
Okay, I'll take the lady there. Where's the nearest? Oh, it's coming slowly. It's coming a little bit quickly. It's going slowly again. It's weaving its way to you.
Thank you, Sally Taylor, the London Centre for Arts and Cultural Exchange. I was at an event hosted by Editorial Intelligence last week on philanthropy. And one of the issues that was raised was the big society's response to the forests, and actually how there was an immediate response to the fact that the forests were going to be privatised, and that this had not been the case with the arts. Now, why was this? Clearly, the public feels some kind of, completely correctly in my view, ownership of the forests. This doesn't happen with the arts, apart from people who are going into their libraries and actually taking all the books out, and well done. I think this does come down to issues around ownership. It does come down to issues around engaging the public much more with the arts, and I absolutely understand about festivals. I think that's an absolutely brilliant point. My question is, should the Arts Council change their slogan to Great Art with Everyone?
It's a very interesting thing, for example, just to take that on a bit further. If you look at the health service, it's massively supported, but actually, between the ages of about 12 and 60, very few people use the health service. You use it very, very rarely. So we don't actually have that much engagement with it unless you're a mother who has a child. So we have this strong affinity to something which we don't use for most of us don't use most of our adult lives very often. But arts connects with most of us a lot of the time. But yet we don't, as you say, the general public have this kind of visceral attachment to it. Anyway, just building on that. Right, take the gentleman there with the tie.
Hi, my name's JJ Charles. I'm from Art Review magazine. I'm very interested in the big society because initially it seemed to be a really good opportunity to talk about civil freedoms, a notion of the civil and public sphere, which was in some way autonomous in the way that Matthew used the word very early on in the introduction to this day. I'd be very excited to know more about the notion of autonomy at some other point. But my question is, we've noticed that actually over the last few years, the business of actually informal relationships and informal organisation, to do with culture, to do with the arts, but in a very small, low-key, grassroots way, has become increasingly trammelled by various forms of state official regulation. Simple things like the gentleman at the front brought up the issue of CRB checks, which is having a very serious effect with regards to people volunteering. People are declining from volunteering because it's too much trouble and they feel that they are somewhat pointed out as being potential threats when actually all they're trying to do is volunteer. Other things like, for example, licensing law, which means that you can't have live music in pubs without a piece of paper, that you can't necessarily organise a public event without getting the Metropolitan Police to sign off your Form 696. Or even, for example, the changes in visiting artists' visas. The points-based immigration system has had a very particular effect on how artists from abroad can come to participate in arts events in this country. So in very many small ways, there's a very clear move towards petty, small over-regulation of what should be spontaneous and informal forms of cultural practice and cultural making. I'm just wondering about whether the big society is really about a certain notion of the active individual, in the sense that it's someone who is left alone by officialdom, by the state, by its agencies, by government, to get on with doing what that subject, that individual, feels best in association with others. So, or is it something else?
Okay. Yeah. And then, yes, oh, fantastic. Great. Hand movement. That is huge. Yeah, I'm definitely calling you after the Iron White shirt. Special authority to speak.
Hello, Marcus Davey, The Roundhouse. I'm just interested in how the big society and governance of arts organisations, when we talk about people getting more involved, the individuals, big society, and how a society is big society, if you want to talk about it, a group of people. How would the panel, say in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, when maybe the big society, we understand exactly what it is and it's kind of got it, the society's embraced this thing, what do you think the makeup of our boards will be? Do you think they'll be elected? Do you think, what do you think how do you think the governance of our organisations will change into the future?
Does governance matter? Yeah. And then, yeah.
Hi, Emilia Telese. I'm a practicing artist and also regional council member of Arts Council, Southeast. From the 1999 project of Year of the Artist until the very recent past, there's been a lot of effort to determine the value, also including the economic value of what artists do for society. And I'm wondering if in the point of view, if the point of view of the government is to enhance what artists do for society, doesn't a big society which emphasizes work which is done for free undo all that has been done to advance the economic value of what artists do, considering that a lot of them already do very underpaid jobs? Thanks.
Okay, and I'll just take the gentleman next to you, and then I'll bring the panel back, and then we'll have to finish.
Hi, David O'Brien, Leeds Metropolitan University, and I was a placement fellow at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. A question for the panel, apart from Jesse. Sorry, Jesse. Could you just restate what you actually mean by the big society? Because what I got from the panel was they don't know what it means, other than it's what we do at the moment, we're going to keep doing it, therefore it's part of the big society. And what I got from the questions was, the questioners don't know what it means either. And it kind of strikes me that as a sector, this is at best maybe incoherent, but at worst just downright contradictory with, one vision of the big society being almost opposed to others, whether it be in libraries or Creative Scotland or UK City of Culture. So could the panel just restate what they actually mean by big society? Thanks.
Okay, so panel, you have to choose, because we've got 7 minutes, one or two of those points to respond to before we break, and I'll start with you, Miranda. Just choose a couple of things you want to come back to.
I loved Sally's thing about great art with everyone. Where are you, Sally? Yeah. Yes, let's see if Alan would agree to that. And then I was really interested by this thing about cultural grassroots spontaneous movement, and I'm really interested in the reading group as a kind of extraordinary cultural phenomenon. They're just exploding, and reading groups not just for, people like me reading Sebastian Faulks. And there's a kind of freedom about that sort of spontaneous grassroots association around an art form that actually I don't think much gets in the way of. So I'm really interested in that. And the thing about work being done free, I think ideally volunteering can lead to jobs. Certainly with the young people we're working with, there's a clear progression from volunteering in a library through to jobs in creative industries.
Great. Jesse?
Right, thanks. I think it's important for me to address the question, have cuts killed the big society as a philosophical project? Well, of course, again, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I absolutely don't think so. I think there is a tension between having to cut funding and the political programme, but you equally have a bigger tension actually in the political programme, and the tension really is as it were of contamination of the whole idea. But the bigger problem is the idea of government as such creating society is essentially a totalitarian one. I mean, in its ultimate level. I mean, it can be a participant in something, it can nudge, enjoin, encourage, exhort, fund at the margins. But I don't think personally that the state as we're creating a project to create society is something worthy of Stalin. On forests versus arts, I think that's a very interesting and good comparison. I mean, let's not forget that the thing that MPs voted on last week had nothing to do with any legislation. It was just a motion. So a rather pleasingly open-minded consultation document, which I encourage everyone to read if they're all up in arms about this, has been put up, and I've no doubt it'll get turned down in due course by people. But there was a wide issue which Matthew raised. People feel an affinity with what they don't know. They often have contempt for what they do know. It's very easy to identify with something, it's very easy for people who never go into forests to get excited about them and forget the phenomenal work that's being done by a diversity of arts organisations on their doorstep. Sweeping away petty regulation, absolutely. Emphasising work done for free destroys economic value. I don't think that's true. I think actually the opposite point was being made earlier, which is that very often it's of course, there's a tiny part of the whole idea, which is much wider even than the arts, but actually it's getting things that you couldn't pay for. It's capturing a kind of value that isn't economically available. And I think that's quite an important point, because and it does have this other point there, which is that if you make it terribly hard for people to volunteer, you can make it hard for people to develop an understanding of and a work habit, and that can also choke off the process of moving into the society of work more widely. So again, I would disagree with that myself.
Great, thank you, Gavin.
Okay, so I'm going to try and do the big society, which is, I think it's good. I think there's an opportunity here, which is, it's not the individual and it's not the state, but it's the common good. That's why I don't think it's new, but I think it's being reframed, and I think we should take the opportunity. I think we shouldn't conflate, even if it would appear to be the case that the cuts that are coming are covered up by a notion of volunteerism. I think it's going to be different, but I don't think it's going to be difficult. I think there are all sorts of opportunities. I think if you start by saying it's going to be difficult, guess what? It's going to be difficult. So I think we have to start from different places and find different solutions. And the last thing I'd say to Amelia's point about people wanting being paid, I think footballers would say the same. but that doesn't stop us from encouraging as many people to play football on every scrap of land that we can, and that leads to people being paid a lot of money for playing football. The same could be true of the arts.
Thank you. Kevin?
In terms of whether big society undermines the role of the artist, I hope it doesn't change it. I think the artist has to be true to themselves. That's the artist's responsibility. I think it does heighten the role of the curator, the artistic director, the people who are the project producers in many respects. Have cuts killed the big society? I think they probably have killed the potential for that, and in that I'll answer what big society might mean, or certainly could mean to me and should mean, which is about adding value. It's about making possibly a greater effort on the part of arts organisations, if we're talking about big society in the context of arts organisations, but making a slightly greater effort to go beyond their traditional reach, where they have maybe a comfort zone, and to just reach slightly wider beyond that. Does that change governance? Not in any elected way, not in any way that governance should, organisations should have the right to self-determination. I think it may change governance because if they make that step to actually listen to new voices, then they'll realise those voices may have a role in governance, but only that should come from the organisations themselves. Big society, I think, means, if I was to bring it down to something, it means volunteerism. And whether it means volunteerism in the point that this gentleman made about the interest, I volunteer to coach soccer because I'm interested in it, or whether it means volunteerism to replace a service, I volunteer to run that library service because the town, the city, the borough needs a library service. I think that's what it actually means in the political pragmatism. It means everything in that stretch. That's not what I think it should mean. I think it should mean, a more active drive to create a slightly more engaged society.
Andrew?
Well, I think big society means giving something back, or valuing individual contributions to where you live or where you work. I think the point about the Year of the Artist was interesting. I was involved in the Year of Artists, which, for those that don't know about it, was 1,000 artists in 1,000 places across the country. And in 2 weeks' time in Scotland, we're going to announce a programme called Creative Futures, which is 200 artists in 200 places across Scotland, and it'll be a rolling programme. And that's actually about places and communities valuing artists, but it's also about respecting the leadership role of artists and giving them space in society to create things that may be of value. I come back to this issue of places to meet, things to celebrate. It may not seem fashionable, but the Dome was an amazingly powerful thing. There was a thing in the Dome in the Millennium that McDonald's sponsored called My Day in the Dome, and basically 100 towns were given £10,000 to come and create their own town celebration in the Dome. Now, I went to 3 of these, and they were really very powerful moments of communities coming together, either young people or young people and adults, and celebrating their town or their county on a national platform. I think it shows the way that culture, almost all of those were cultural celebrations, the way that culture really can help us shine a light on the things that are positive about where we live. And I think if we can capture that as a cultural sector, we've got a very rich scene here.
Great. Well, at the end of the football match when they hold up the board for the number of minutes left and there's an audible gasp because there's more than they thought. Well, I've just been told I'm holding up 10 minutes. Suddenly we've been given 10 minutes extra time. So we've got a chance for a couple more points. Fantastic. I'll take these 2 in direct parallel line there. I want to say, by the way, before you ask the question, I want to say if I was on the panel, I would say I think this governance issue is really quite interesting because I think on the one side, big society points to the idea of the importance of accountability and stakeholders and all of that. I also think those forms of governance can make organisations quite slow, not terribly spontaneous. It's very interesting that most charities that are formed now don't have memberships, they don't have any of that kind of stuff. They're very, very focused on their mission. So I think there's some quite interesting challenges about how you get governance right if you want organisations to be close to the community. I say that in an over-governed or from an over-governed organisation. Anyway, yeah.
Hi, I'm very excited about the idea of scoring a goal in injury time now. I'm Robin Simpson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Voluntary Arts Network. We're the UK and Ireland-wide body that represents the amateur arts. So I've wanted, first of all, just to say to Gavin, Thank you. And the point I wanted to make was one of the things you often hear in any discussion about the big society is this cry, we're doing it already. And it seems to me that's true up to a point, depending on your definition. But what we're not doing in the amateur arts, although there's somewhere in the region of 10 million people in the UK regularly participating in an amateur arts group, what we're very poor at is actually connecting those groups to the rest of their communities. And a lot of those groups exist in a slightly blinkered existence, focused on their art form quite naturally, but aren't very good at connecting to the rest of their community, or indeed to the rest of the arts sector. And I think there's been a problem there about the tendency to denial from the arts about the existence of the amateurs. So I think this agenda gives us a reason and excuse to look again at how we connect and how those amateur arts organisations become part of the arts firmament.
I absolutely agree with that. Behind you.
Hi, my name's Stuart Mullins from Theatre Ears. I am genuinely confused in that we're talking about this idea as if it is new and that we haven't been doing it, and we have. I've been spending my whole career in big societies, or societies as they used to be called, and I don't quite know why this is being promoted as a big idea when I think it's quite clearly a cloak and dagger way of cutting public services. And nobody's said that, and maybe it just needs to be said. It needs to be challenged on that basis. Why aren't we talking about the arts leading in notions of preventative healthcare, or in the development of after-school education, or in the development of information and communication technology within communities? Why are we talking about something that's essentially about cutting public services?
Okay, thank you. I think a lot of people do say that. Right, anyone else? Yeah. There's a microphone coming to you really quickly. We'll take two more.
Thanks. I went to the session this morning about innovation, and I've been sitting here thinking, where's the link? I'm Belinda Kidd, and I run Bath Festivals, which has got, love the stuff about festivals, and I can very easily talk about our role in the big society in terms of our volunteering, our education programming, the huge mass participation events we do. It's less easy when I'm talking about a huge amount of new music that we commission and the very, intellectual, very challenging work that we do. And I'm really sort of thinking, what's the thread? And I think at one point somebody on the panel talked about internationalism and sort of sense of an even bigger society that's connecting internationally. And I was thinking about that thing about stepping. I mean, I've worked all my life in arts and social engagement, and I share with other people, 30 years ago I was working in the East End, or I've worked in North Birmingham, I've worked in North Staffordshire and so on, involving the arts in society. And now I'm running a festival that covers that whole spectrum. And I can't really quite formulate the question, but there is something about what is the role of sort of artistic innovation, about something that's very easily, people in Bath, they're quite often very easy to talk about, Bath festivals, they're elitist. And I'm going, no, they're not. They're part of this big society, much as I have sometimes problems with those words. So I think
Okay, so participation and excellence. And then finally?
This is a slight plea, following on from what has just been said, about, we're talking about a big society as if people aren't formed through education and experiences and so on. And we're talking as if we don't need to look after the future audiences and the future practitioners that we need. And this conference has been, I think, shocking in its complete sort of ignoring of higher education and the massive cuts in higher education. And this is not an elitist point, this is a point about how we value the people who we are training to work in the arts. All the people here who've come out of music conservatoires, art colleges, drama departments and so on, who've become artists, who've become art administrators and so on. And these are the people who, after all, are practitioners, they are running things, they're people who are going to facilitate these big society developments. And where are these people going to come from if we are making university fees so high so that we are, frankly, going to reduce the number of students who can work with arts organisations, certainly who will become postgraduates and take on the kinds of arts collaboration and research projects where they're working with artists, which are very important to the arts at the moment and have been a very important growth thing in the last 10 or 20 years. I'm very concerned. I think that the last point about how this is really a kind of concealing cuts so that we have nice, fluffy people working, the idea that we should just sort of work in a kind of fluffy way. I mean, we really should be arguing for keeping our training and our education so that we have the best arts available to everybody.
Okay, thank you. Well, panel, as my clock says that we've got 2 minutes, 8 seconds, you might want to desist from involving yourself in the debate about tuition fees and higher education unless you've got a brilliant way of summing it all up. 1 point, please, to finish the session, and I'll start with Kevin.
Just on the issue of elitism, as you call it, or on the issue of new work, I think, as I said earlier, I think there needs to be leadership, there needs to be research, there needs to be new work. Big society should also be about adding value and providing that leadership and providing that kind of creative ways of thinking. So I think there has to be a place for that, and it's like the question about will the role of the artist be undermined? The artist will continue to do what they do anyway, but we need to make sure there are spaces for those artists to be valued and to be nurtured in the way that we do in science, in other fields.
Thank you. Andrew?
I'm coming back to forests. I remember somebody came to see me when I worked at Northern Arts and said we've got a 30-year plan for the Great North Forest, and I handed my 3-year plan forward for the Arts Council. And maybe if you're looking at something like a big society or a rallying call, you need the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year horizon. And some of the big things we did in Newcastle Gateshead in the North East were kind of visionary 10-year plans to change the level of opportunity to access the arts. So I think if we're going to engage with this, I think there's the small little things we can do now, but let's look for the moments on the horizon. I mean, one of the best places to be in the UK for the next couple of years is going to be Derry. Glasgow's another because it's got the Commonwealth Games to look forward to, obviously London with the Olympics. Those moments that you can look forward to and build something towards are really important.
Miranda?
I wanted to pick up on the point about innovation. And for me, I think anything that, whether you think big society is jargon or whatever, anything that shines more of a light on the power of involving the kind of public as participants in shaping art has to be a good thing. And some of the stuff, I've seen and you'll have seen with young people where they become, and this is the jargon from all our Arts Council applications, but co-creators, boy, is that powerful.
Jesse?
Very quickly, point on governance. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Accountability sometimes has everyone panicked about filling the forms in rather than actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And one of the reasons why I think the government has taken a lot of the ring-fencing off local government funding is to allow more innovation, and more flexibility, and even, indeed, some creative failure. We're doing it already. Of course, it's true. This country has a staggeringly rich and fertile arts environment. It's not true about other aspects of the big society. I mean, that isn't true. I mean, the truth of the matter is that if big government was so fabulously successful, we wouldn't be declining in social and educational indicators as we have done relative to other countries over the last 20 years. So it represents a wider view. Is this a cloak and dagger way to cut public services? Well, emphatically not. I mean, for 2 or 3 reasons. One is because certainly the Conservative Party, and I don't know about the Liberal Democrats, but have been talking about these issues ever since David Cameron became leader, which was 5 years ago, well before there was any economic crisis. Secondly, because the commitment was made before the last election to match government spending, precisely in part as a way to stop arguing about the economics of it and start focusing on the other aspects that make a society successful or not successful. If you look at the spirit level, we know societies succeed better than others. Some do marvellously well and some do terribly badly. What are the different components of that success? And you'll recall the authors say it isn't just about economic inequality, it's about a whole host of other things. So there is a failure here which this is designed to address that goes way beyond the arts. And finally, talking about ignoring higher education, I mean, I used to teach myself at UCL and at Birkbeck, so I'm extremely sensitive to that. There are many universities in this country where the student has a lousy student experience. And this is a sector which is an absolute glory of this country, potentially, and has been in the past and has been recently. but it could get better, and it could, and we may find that this actually helps it to get better. The interesting thing is, in places around the world where student fees are charged, more kids go to school, go to universities where the higher fees are charged than in the lower, than vice versa, which is a staggering fact. So if the effect of this is to get more cash into higher education institutions and give them more flexibility to succeed, then we may all be long-term beneficiaries. And we should be judging this not on a 3 to 5 year basis, but on a 20-year basis. That's the exciting opportunity, as was said earlier.
And the final word goes to Gavin.
I think I'd argue against innovation. I'm not a great innovator. I'd suggest in any company that I work with to be obvious rather than to try and innovate. And often you'll come to something original by trying to be obvious. And I'll give you one good example. I don't think we should work in partnerships. I really, really think partnerships don't work. I think we should build friendships, however, and I think we should work with people who we care about whether they achieve their goals. And I don't think that that's an interpretation that most people would put on partnerships, which are generally, let's put aside our differences to get the money.
Thank you, Gavin.
That's very good.
Pithy and provocative right to the end. So I suspect you're going to have until... What time until the coffee break? Great leader. Still 4:30. My God, you're going to have to run up to that room. All right, so thank you all for joining us, and can I ask you to thank our splendid panel? Thank you.